Opening tone and premise. Ghastly journal. Introduction. The rain had not yet started when the voice of the Ghastly Journal's host drifted through the speakers, steady but carrying that faint undercurrent of unease that seasoned listeners had learned to recognize. Welcome, the voice began, to another journey into the shadows. It was the sort of greeting that did not simply open a story, but lowered a gate behind you. There was no turning back. Tonight's episode, the host promised, would not be for the faint of heart, not because it involved mere violence or even death, but because the events described would challenge the very structure of what listeners believed reality to be. This was not the sort of tale that stayed safely behind the glass of history. It reached forward. It touched. The host explained that the story had been assembled like a patchwork quilt from scraps no one had meant to survive, smudged pages of personal journals, brittle parchment entries from county archives, heavily redacted memoranda buried in government vaults, and whispered family recollections passed down like a curse. Individually, each piece might be dismissed an anecdote, an embellishment, a drunken superstition. Together, however, the patterns were too precise, too consistent across centuries and geography to be coincidence. What the listener was about to hear had been lived hidden and, in certain cases, deliberately erased from public record. Some would call what followed a ghost story. Others might label it the fevered ramblings of disturbed minds. The host refused either definition. There are things, they said, that do not fit neatly into human categories. They are not alive, not dead, not even what we would call supernatural. They are simply other, and sometimes they notice us. That was the crux of this tale, a history not just of a family's ruin, but of something vast, incomprehensible, and patient, a thing that chose the Addingtons as its entry point into our world. The warning was issued plainly. This was not horror that lived only in the past tense. The account, pieced together from sources never intended for the public, was a continuum stretching from the mid-19th century through wars, fires, reconstructions, and into the present day. If you are sensitive to matters of existential dread, the voice advised, this may be the moment to stop listening. The soundscape behind the narration was subtle. The whisper of wind over empty moors, the low groan of wood under unseen weight, a faint rhythmic tap that did not belong to the music. The kind of sound you could almost explain, but not quite. Listeners leaned in. The host's cadence slowed as if savoring the gravity of the transition. The Addington story, they said, is not just a cautionary tale. It is a ledger. In its columns are ambition and greed, cruelty and secrecy, loss and disappearance. But running through every entry is a thread of something else, a signal from somewhere we cannot map yet, which has always been here. Waiting. It was not the usual Ghastly Journal preamble. There was a tension in the voice, a flicker of something that might have been genuine unease. Remember, the host added softly, doors work both ways. From there, the name was spoken, Addington Manor. A location that had been rebuilt and burned, abandoned and reclaimed, investigated and quarantined, yet never truly silenced. A place where the air was said to hang heavier than elsewhere, where shadows stretched against the light, and where generation after generation, someone in the family inevitably found the thing that should never have been found. The host took a breath, the pause loaded with promise and threat alike. Tonight, they said, we walk into those halls together. Nature of the horror. Existential threat beyond the physical. The horrors that had taken root within Addington Manor were never content to remain confined to the realm of physical danger. A house that merely claimed lives would be tragic. A house that unstitched the fabric of the mind, that eroded one's grasp on reality itself, was something else entirely. Survivors, few though they were, spoke less of creaking floors or spectral figures, and more of moments when the laws they had trusted all their lives bent without breaking. Angles that hurt the eyes, distances that grew and shrank between one heartbeat and the next, shadows that seemed to regard you rather than the other way around. The threat was existential. In the truest sense, it struck not at the body, but at the foundation of the self. Visitors described leaving the manor unsure if they were the same person who had entered. It was not simply the things they saw, but the certainty, cold and clinical, that the house or what spoke through it now knew them. It knew the pitch of their fear. It knew the shapes of their private desires, and it had no need to rush. The knowledge that it was waiting was enough to corrode them from within. Historical accounts hinted that the phenomenon did not merely inhabit the building but extended its influence beyond walls and land boundaries the way a contagion might move through water or air. Those who spent time in the East Wing, especially near the cellar beneath it, often reported a sensation later described in journals as being thinned, as though their essence were being stretched towards some point beyond their vision. Many returned home only to dream of the manor's corridors, even if they had never walked them. In rare cases, these dreams synchronized between multiple people, sharing identical details, down to the pattern of cracks in the plaster or the way the dust motes drifted in the light. It was this nature of the horror, its ability to trespass into minds and memories, that made Addington Manor so dangerous to investigate. Physical barriers could be breached, guards evaded locks, picked, but there was no lock for the human mind, no defense once the thing behind the walls decided to notice you. And it noticed in patterns recurring with unnerving precision across decades of family moves in. The patriarch changes, the children develop strange games, disappearances begin, and finally, the fire. Always the fire. The host of the ghastly journal framed it with deliberate care. We tell ourselves the world is ordered, that physics, biology, and history are constants we can trust. But here is a place that plays by rules older and stranger than those rules written in symbols we cannot read, but which recognize us all the same. The implication was clear. This was not a haunting that could be laid to rest, nor a curse that could be broken. This was contact with something for which the human race had no name, and the Addingtons were simply the most enduring and perhaps the most willing door through which it entered. Purchase of Addington Manor, 1842. The year was 1842 when Edward Addington, industrialist opportunist and man of precise appetites, secured the sprawling estate in the mist-laden highlands of northern England. To some, the purchase was a stroke of good fortune. To others, it was an act of willful blindness. The manor had been in the hands of the disgraced Blackwood family for generations before their sudden decline, a decline marked by scandal, financial ruin, and whispers of darker transgressions. It came to market at a price so low that it made the front page of local papers, not for its affordability, but for the unspoken question of why no one else had claimed it. Edward dismissed the local warnings as provincial nonsense, the kind of mutterings he believed kept rural minds in check. His associates in London praised his decisiveness. Land was land, and the Blackwood property was as grand as it was undervalued sprawling grounds, centuries-old stonework, and a location remote enough to offer privacy for both business and pleasure. The low price was not a red flag to Edward, it was an invitation. Yet the estate sat upon ground older than any deed or title. The surrounding moors bore the remnants of Neolithic stone circles, some half swallowed by the earth, others stark and upright against the wind. Prehistoric burial mounds rose in the shadows of the hills, their shapes precise despite centuries of weather. Archaeologists, in their occasional forays, had speculated that the region had once been a ritual hub for pre-Celtic cultures, a place chosen for its qualities that in the language of modern science might be described as electromagnetic anomalies, though locals spoke of a presence with the same matter-of-fact tone they used to discuss the weather. Edward saw no obstacle here, only opportunity. His fortune, built in coal and steel, had been forged in environments far more hostile than rural superstition. He had mined deeper shafts than any competitor dared, sending men down into blackness so profound it might as well have been another world. Accidents were frequent, fatalities inevitable, but Edward had long ago learned that human life was simply another resource, replaceable if one knew where to look. The rumors about strange fossils found in his deepest tunnels had been quietly handled. In Edward's experience, anything could be made to disappear, be it a worker's complaint, a corpse, or an inconvenient truth. The Blackwood estate was his now, and whatever shadow lingered over it would be bent to his will. He had not yet learned that some shadows do not bend. They absorb ancient site significance. From the moment Edward Addington set foot on the grounds of his new estate, the land seemed to resist him in small, almost imperceptible ways. The moors rolled outward like a vast heaving sea of grass and stone broken only by the jutting silhouettes of structures far older than the manor itself. Neolithic stone circles dotted the landscape, their weathered monoliths, leaning at impossible angles, yet never falling. Even in the constant wind, the air within those circles was unnervingly still. Shepherds and hunters gave them a wide berth, muttering that the stones remembered. Burial mounds, too, were scattered through the hills, some little more than gentle rises in the earth, others steep enough to break the horizon. Generations of local children had been warned not to play near them, not because of any superstition, but because those who lingered too long came home, altered. Not injured, not visibly sick, but changed in ways that unnerved their families. Quieter, perhaps, or oddly fixated on patterns they'd never noticed before. Edward's London associates saw these features as quaint remnants of a bygone age. He saw potential. To him, these were assets to be marketed, dramatic backdrops for hunting parties, conversation pieces for dinner guests. He never entertained the notion that these places might have been chosen deliberately thousands of years ago for reasons no modern survey could chart. But the land had a documented history of anomalies. Centuries-old parish records described livestock wandering into certain hollows and emerging days later thin and unsteady as though they had been walking in circles the entire time. The sky over the estate was known for peculiar displays of light auroras, where no auroras should be flashes without thunder. In the language of modern geology, the area sat on intersecting bands of unusual magnetic activity. Compasses spun without reason. Iron nails left in the soil overnight would blacken as if burned. To Edward, these were trifles. At worst, they were curiosities to be explained away. At best, they added a kind of primitive glamour to the property's reputation. He entertained archaeologists when it suited him, feeding them just enough access to boost the manor's profile without letting their work disrupt his plans. What he did not mention to his guests, nor even to his wife, was that in the months after the purchase, he began to dream. The dreams always started the same. He stood in the largest of the stone circles, the wind roaring outside its perimeter, but perfectly still inside. Overhead, the stars shifted in slow, deliberate arcs, revealing constellations he did not recognize. Then came the sound, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, vibrating up through his bones. In the dream, he would kneel, press his palm to the soil, and feel something, not warmth exactly, but a living awareness, an ancient attention turning toward him. Edward told himself it was nothing a mind trick of an overworked man in new surroundings, but the timing was undeniable. The dreams began the first night he slept under the roof of Addington Manor, and they never once repeated outside its grounds. If he had paused to connect these visions to the countless warnings from locals, perhaps the next decade of Addington history would have been different. But Edward was a man who interpreted omens only when they favored his ambitions. Edward's ruthless empire. Before he became the master of Addington Manor, Edward Addington had already built a reputation in England's industrial centres as a man who saw opportunity where others saw danger, and who exploited that difference with surgical precision. His coal and steel operations had expanded rapidly during the Industrial Revolution, but expansion came at a cost paid almost entirely by others. His mines were deeper, his mills hotter, his quotas higher than those of any competitor. Where rival companies hesitated to dig into dangerous seams of coal, Edward drove his men down without hesitation. He brought in laborers from the poorest districts from across the Channel, from anywhere desperation could be bought cheaply. Safety was a luxury he neither offered nor believed in. If a tunnel flooded, another was dug. If a shaft collapsed, the rubble was cleared only enough to keep production moving. Losses were tallied like ledger entries, unfortunate but replaceable. Rumors of strange finds in his deepest mines, fossils unlike anything catalogued, fragments of bone too massive to belong to any known animal, were quietly buried under paperwork and bribes. Workers who spoke too openly about what they'd seen were either reassigned to distant sites or vanished entirely, their names struck from company rolls. On more than one occasion, the bodies of labor organizers washed ashore along the Thames, tongues removed hands, folded neatly over their chests. The newspapers avoided printing the most disturbing details, but in factory taverns everyone knew who had given the order. Edward thrived in this atmosphere of calculated cruelty. Power, he believed, was not inherited but taken, and it was taken most effectively when one understood both the fears and desires of others. His was not the blunt force of an unthinking tyrant, but the cold precision of a man who enjoyed the mechanics of dominance. This fascination with control extended beyond the material. While Edward mocked superstition in public and private, he amassed a personal library of occult texts rare even among dedicated scholars. Some were printed in Hebrew, others in Sanskrit, still others in scripts no living linguist could identify. He paid handsomely for tutors who could read these languages aloud to him, insisting that hearing the words was more important than translating them. Visitors to his London home reported evening gatherings attended by an unlikely mix of industrial magnates, members of parliament, and academics from obscure fields. The windows would be shuttered, the air heavy with strange aromas, bitter resins, metallic tangs, scents that seemed to cling to clothing for days afterward. What happened in these meetings was never discussed, but servants whispered of chanting in multiple voices of guests who emerged pale and shaken as if something essential had been taken from them. By the time Edward turned his attention to Addington Manor, he was already fluent in a language of power that most men never learned. He understood leveraged secrecy and the potency of things unseen. To him, the estate was not just a home. It was a stage, a place to consolidate influence, both earthly and otherwise. What he did not yet understand was that in this particular theatre, he was not the playwright. He was merely a character stepping into a role written long before his birth. Occult interests. Edward's interest in the occult was not the dilettante curiosity of a gentleman collector. It was the focused obsession of a man who believed that knowledge, no matter how obscure, could be weaponized. He approached ancient rituals and forbidden texts the same way he approached the steel market, identifying weaknesses, exploiting gaps, and absorbing whatever would give him an edge. His private library became his true workshop. Among its shelves were volumes bound in materials that resisted easy classification, neither leather nor any known fabric, some warm to the touch as though faintly alive. The books were arranged with meticulous care, not by author or chronology, but by some private taxonomy only Edward understood. Many bore no titles at all, only sigils pressed into the covers, the meaning of which remained opaque to all but him. He employed a rotation of tutors, each specializing in a different ancient language: Hebrew, Aramaic, Old Persian, even reconstructed Proto-Indo-European. The more obscure the script, the more it interested him. Edward often insisted these languages carried sounds and structures capable of unlocking things, though he never specified what. Servants delivering tea to his study at night sometimes overheard these tutors reading passages aloud, their voices low, but trembling as if the act itself was dangerous. The gatherings in his London residence grew in frequency as the years passed. Invitations were extended not only to the powerful, but to those who owed him favors, to those whose careers or reputations could be compromised. Attendees were reminded implicitly that what they saw or heard was not for public discussion. Guests arrived in carriages after dusk and departed before dawn. Faces worn, clothing smelling faintly of smoke and something sweeter, more cloying. The servants' accounts passed in whispers painted a consistent picture: candles arranged in intricate patterns, mirrors placed at odd angles to reflect and multiply the light bowls of liquid that shimmered unnaturally. Participants would speak in unison, their voices overlapping like echoes in an empty cathedral. Sometimes the chanting would be interrupted by a sound that did not belong to any of them, an undercurrent deeper and older, vibrating the glass in the windows. When Edward acquired Addington Manor, these practices did not stop. If anything, they intensified. The estate's isolation allowed for rituals on a scale impossible in the city. The East Wing, even during renovation, became a private sanctum where no laborer was allowed without his permission. Crates of books, artifacts, and sealed jars were delivered directly there, bypassing the main house entirely. Edward's public dismissal of superstition remained unchanged. He continued to scoff at local talk of curses, but in his private writings, later recovered from a hidden compartment in his desk, there are repeated references to the convergence, the circle, and the mouth that waits. These phrases appeared alongside sketches of geometric patterns that bore an uncanny resemblance to the ancient stone circles scattered around the manor's grounds. Whether Edward believed he had discovered their purpose or intended to repurpose them for his own ends remains uncertain. What is clear is that he recognized in Addington Manor not just a home, but a site uniquely suited to the kind of work he had been preparing for all his life. Renovation begins. When Edward Addington announced his plans to renovate the manor, it was not with the measured caution of someone dealing with a centuries-old estate, but with the ruthless speed of an industrialist used to bending environments to his will. He wasted no time in assembling a workforce, though the recruitment itself hinted at the first signs of the locals' deep-seated unease. Not a single man from the surrounding villages agreed to take the job. The refusal was almost uniform, polite at first, then firm when pressed. Some cited prior obligations, others feigned illness or claimed their families needed them at home. The truth whispered over pints in the taverns was simpler. No one wanted to set foot inside Addington Manor. Too many claimed to have heard the place at night, its long corridors groaning as if in pain, its windows reflecting shapes that had no business being there. Even those who had never been close to it described an inexplicable weight in the air whenever they passed within sight of the east wing. Edward circumvented this reluctance by bringing in labourers from far beyond the county. Immigrants newly arrived in England, desperate for work and with no knowledge of the warnings that kept the locals away. Most spoke little English, their understanding of the whispered cautions at the docks or in boarding houses too limited to matter. For them, the job was an opportunity, not a curse. From the first day on site, the crew reported oddities. There were sudden drops in temperature so sharp that frost formed on their tools despite the summer heat. A carpenter swore he saw his breath fog in the east wing's hallway while sunlight streamed in through the windows. More than one man complained of a constant low tapping from inside the walls, steady, rhythmic, almost like code. When the foreman dismissed it as rats, the tapping seemed to grow louder as though offended by the explanation. Then came the sensation of being watched. It wasn't the casual awareness of another person in the room. It was a focused, invasive attention, as if the gaze could reach inside the skull. Men began refusing to work alone in certain areas, particularly the east wing's upper floors. Tools were found neatly rearranged in the mornings as though someone or something had been working through the night. Edward, unwilling to tolerate delays, installed a foreman with a reputation for breaking strikes and enforcing discipline with his fists. Complaints were met with docked wages or immediate dismissal, but the measures had little effect on morale. The sense of wrongness was too pervasive, and slowly workers began to vanish, not through resignation, but by leaving in the dead of night without collecting their pay, abandoning belongings, rather than stay another day. Even these absences might have been overlooked had it not been for what happened next. The first death was chalked up to carelessness, the second to misfortune. By the third, whispers had begun that the manor itself was claiming lives. Worker fatalities. The first to die was Grigory, a stonemason from Warsaw, who had come to England with his cousin. Grigory was experienced, careful to the point of paranoia when working at heights. Witnesses later swore that he had been perfectly steady on the scaffold when he suddenly stopped, gaze fixed on something inside the east wing window. His expression shifted from curiosity to sheer terror before he stepped backward into empty air. The fall broke his neck instantly. When asked what Gregory had seen, the man working beside him said only, "Nothing." There was nothing there. The second was Thomas, a carpenter from Devon known for his strength and for the story retold often of the day he dove into the Thames to save a drowning child. Thomas was working near the manor's lake on a crisp autumn morning when he vanished from sight. His body was found hours later floating face down in the center of the water. There were no signs of a struggle, no injuries, no torn clothing. Only one detail stood out. The whites of his eyes were not simply pale, they were bleached as if all pigment had been stripped away. The third death was the one that left even the most hardened laborers shaken. William, barely 16, was an apprentice to one of the masons. He was last seen carrying tools into the cellar late one afternoon. When he did not return for supper, the men searched for him and found him hanging from a beam nearly 15 feet above the floor. The rope was not tied in any knot they recognized. In fact, it bore no knot at all, appearing instead as a seamless loop woven directly around his neck. There was no furniture or scaffolding nearby to account for how he had reached such a height. The authorities were quick to label all 3 deaths as tragic accidents. The county magistrate, Sir Reginald Thorpe, was a regular guest at Edward's gatherings in London and seemed eager to close the matter without deeper investigation. Thorpe's name would later surface in connection to the Blackwood family, though he took great care to hide this fact. To the men still working on the site, the message was clear. Whatever was happening inside the manor, there would be no official help, no justice. And so the workforce continued to shrink, leaving Edward to replace the dead and the vanished, with new recruits from farther afield, each as unaware as the last. Authorities' complicity. If the string of deaths troubled Edward, he did not show it. In fact, his completion bonuses grew larger, as if money alone could outmatch the mounting dread. But the truth was, Edward had no fear of legal entanglements, not with Sir Reginald Thorpe in his debt. Thorpe's official role as county magistrate gave him the power to direct local investigations, and he wielded that authority with surgical precision. Police reports were brief, clinical, and devoid of any detail that might invite further inquiry. Witness statements that mentioned unusual circumstances were quietly omitted or corrected before being filed. Edward's influence extended beyond cash. He had a knack for finding the vulnerabilities of powerful men, and Thorpe was no exception. There were rumors of gambling debts, of indiscretions that would ruin a magistrate's reputation if made public. Whatever the truth, the arrangement was clear. Edward built Thorpe shielded. This complicity created a dangerous feedback loop. The more Edward saw the law bend in his favor, the bolder he became. Strange shipments began arriving at night, crates unloaded directly into the East Wing, under guard, their contents unlisted in any manifest. Workers swore they heard chanting after midnight, low and resonant, coming from behind locked doors. Once a laborer claimed to see a thin column of light shooting upward from the East Wing's roof, vanishing into the clouds. When he reported it to the foreman, the man's pay was cut in half for idleness. Within a week, he was gone. Vanished without notice, his bunk empty, his tools neatly stacked as though he'd planned to return. It was during this period that the locals began avoiding not just the manor, but the roads that passed within sight of it. Carriages would detour miles out of the way, and shepherds refused to graze their flocks near the property. The sense of isolation that Edward seemed to cultivate was almost complete. And in that isolation, whatever he was building inside the East Wing, be it a room, a machine, or something stranger, was taking shape unchecked and unseen. Victorian opulence and unsettling design. When the final scaffolding came down in late 1842, Addington Manor stood as a gleaming monument to Victorian ambition, or so it appeared at first glance. From the outside, it was the kind of Gothic revival dream that would have graced the cover of any architectural periodical of the day. Pointed arches, ornate tracery, carved into pale stone gargoyles, crouched at the roofline like silent sentinels. The symmetry was precise. The landscaping immaculate, every hedge and gravel path placed with military discipline. To the casual eye, it was the portrait of grandeur. Yet even from the grounds there was something subtly disorienting about the structure. Its towers seemed to lean imperceptibly toward the east wing, as though gravity itself had been bent in that direction. Windows reflected not the view before them, but strange distortions, elongated trees, doubled shadows, the faint outline of figures that disappeared when approached. Inside, the disquiet deepened. Edward's tastes, shaped by both his worldly travels and his occult pursuits, produced an interior that defied conventional harmony. The great hall was paved in polished black marble veined with crimson streaks that seemed almost wet in certain light. Above a coffered ceiling was painted with astronomical charts, remarkably accurate according to visiting scholars, yet containing celestial bodies not catalogued in any contemporary atlas. The corridors were lined with Persian carpets, woven in patterns that shifted subtly when viewed from different angles, the designs looping into shapes that seemed to follow the observer's gaze. Rooms transitioned without logic. A dining chamber with Italian frescoes might open directly into a library with Norse rune stones embedded in the floor. Doors stood where no doorways had been in the original plans. Conversely, some rooms were accessible only by passage through others, forcing visitors to navigate in circuits that always seemed to lead them back toward the east wing. In the great salon, Edward had installed tall mirrors framed in gilt so intricate it seemed almost alive. Guests remarked uneasily that their reflections appeared to move a heartbeat out of sync with them, as though they were subtly studied. A rumor began among the staff that if one stood before the mirrors at midnight, their reflection would be absent entirely, though no one admitted to testing this more than once. Edward called it a masterpiece. Others, even those who benefited from his favor, whispered that the house felt built wrong. One architect who toured it privately left with an uncharacteristic pallor, muttering that certain staircases contained extra steps that did not exist in physical measurement, but which the body nevertheless felt when climbing them. The crown jewel of the design in Edward's mind was the West Wing Library, a vast 3-story chamber lined with spiral staircases and latticed galleries. While much of its collection was accessible to visiting dignitaries, a locked section at the far end contained volumes bound in materials no one could identify. Those books visible through the glass, but never handled, seemed to draw the eye uncomfortably as though aware of being regarded. It was in every superficial way a triumph of wealth and vision. But beneath the polished surface, the structure was already becoming something else. Something that bore the imprint not only of Edward's will, but of whatever had claimed the land long before his arrival. Library of Forbidden Knowledge. The library of Addington Manor was not just a repository of books. it was a cathedral to Edward's obsessions. The space itself was overwhelming, a 3-story vault of oak and iron lit by high-arched windows that admitted thin, cold light even in summer. Every surface seemed touched by deliberate intent. The staircases curled upward like serpents, each step carved with symbols so finely etched that one had to kneel to see them clearly. The public section was impressive by any standard leather-bound editions of classical literature, illuminated manuscripts, shelves of contemporary scientific treatises. But even these safe volumes were arranged according to some private logic of Edward's making. Titles dealing with disparate subjects, astronomy, metallurgy, theology, were grouped together in a way that suggested connections only he could see. Then there was the restricted section, a wall of locked glass cases that occupied nearly the entire far side of the library. Behind them sat the books Edward considered too valuable or too dangerous for casual perusal. Scholars who glimpsed them from a distance described bindings of unfamiliar textures, colors too deep to be mere dyes. One was said to shimmer faintly as though lit from within. Another appeared to pulse in the dim light almost in time with the heartbeat of anyone standing close. The languages within these volumes were not merely obscure. Some had no known roots at all. Pages were filled with spiraling glyphs that seemed to alter between readings as if the act of observation was itself a form of translation. Interleaved between the text were illustrations, diagrams of geometries that defied Euclidean understanding, anatomical renderings of creatures that could not exist, and recurring depictions of a circular chamber with a patterned floor and human figures positioned at its edges. Edward was known to spend long hours in the locked section, sometimes emerging at dawn with ink-stained fingers and eyes red from lack of sleep. On more than one occasion, servants delivering breakfast reported hearing voices in the library when Edward was supposedly alone, low murmuring tones punctuated by pauses as though in conversation. No second voice was ever identified. Visitors were shown only the most innocuous corners of the collection, but even there, something was off. A visiting antiquarian later remarked that he had the distinct sensation the books were aware of him, their spines subtly angled in his direction, as he moved as though following him from shelf to shelf. When he mentioned this to Edward in jest, the industrialist merely smiled thinly and replied, "They're good judges of character." The library was by design a map of Edward's mind, a labyrinth of interconnected ideas, half-forgotten truths, and dangerous possibilities. It was also, whether by accident or intention, a lure, one that seemed to invite not just human curiosity, but the attention of something far older. Guests' experiences. The housewarming celebration in December 1842 was meant to be the crowning moment of Edward Addington's social ambitions. Carriages arrived in a steady procession through the snow, bearing the most distinguished figures of London society, industrial magnates, members of Parliament, foreign dignitaries. The air was thick with the scent of pine and polished brass, the crackle of fireplaces, competing with the strains of a string quartet in the great hall. Yet the night unfolded under a subtle, unshakable pall. Guests who arrived in high spirits found their conversations faltering without reason, laughter dying in their throats. The rooms seemed to drink in the warmth, leaving pockets of inexplicable chill that no fire could touch. More than one guest remarked privately that the air felt thick, as though breathing required greater effort than usual. Lady Harrington, a close friend of Eleanor Addington, would later write in her diary that she awoke several times in her guest chamber to the sensation of being watched. On one occasion, she swore she saw the doorknob turning slowly, though the door remained locked. She left at first light the following morning, vowing never to return. Others complained of vivid, unsettling dreams standing alone in a vast, unlit corridor, hearing the echo of their own footsteps multiply until it became a march behind them, glimpsing faces in mirrors that did not match their own, finding themselves drawn toward the east wing despite never consciously deciding to walk there. These experiences were always recounted in hushed tones, if at all, for fear of being dismissed as overwrought. The more superstitious guests excused themselves early, preferring the risk of a winter journey home to another hour within the manor's walls. Those who stayed the night often left before breakfast, citing sudden business in the city. Servants noted that some guests refused to sleep with the lights extinguished, and a few demanded that their bedroom doors be locked from the outside. Edward, of course, dismissed such accounts as the overactive imaginations of a class unaccustomed to the isolation of the countryside. But Eleanor noticed the change in her friend's demeanor. Where once she had been surrounded by lively conversation and shared confidences, she now found herself increasingly alone in the grand rooms of her husband's creation. The parties continued for a time, but the invitations began to dwindle, and with them the last traces of ordinary life in Addington Manor. It was as though the house had begun its slow, deliberate work, not in sudden violence, but in quiet erosion, stripping away comfort, companionship, and the illusion of safety, until only those it had chosen remained. Eleanor's initial withdrawal. When Eleanor Addington first moved into the newly completed manor, she played her role with practiced elegance, graceful hostess, attentive mother, charming companion to her husband's influential guests. But as winter surrendered to an unusually harsh spring, her presence in the social rooms began to diminish. At first it was explained away as fatigue from the constant hosting, but those who knew her best noticed a change that went beyond simple exhaustion. Her eyes, once quick to light with wit, began to wander in the middle of conversations as though drawn by something just beyond the speaker's shoulder. She startled at small noises, sometimes freezing mid-step, head cocked, listening intently to some distant sound no one else could hear. At gatherings, she often drifted toward windows or doorways, standing silently, lips moving faintly as if speaking to herself. Servants reported that she had dismissed her long-time lady's maid without warning, claiming the woman had been watching her and reporting to others. When the staff pressed for clarification, Eleanor only shook her head and muttered, "It doesn't matter. She knows now." From that point on, Eleanor insisted on preparing her own meals, living for days at a time on little more than tea and dry toast. She refused food made in the manor kitchen, stating simply that she could taste the watching in it. More troubling still were her reports of hearing children's laughter echoing through the empty corridors, especially near the east wing. At first, she thought it might be her own children playing tricks, but she quickly realized the laughter was unfamiliar, higher, thinner, and carrying a note of sadness that lingered long after the sound faded. She began to avoid certain hallways entirely, taking long detours to reach her destination rather than pass a door that seemed to her to breathe as she walked by. The most disturbing habit noted by several maids was her tendency to stop mid-sentence, tilt her head, and whisper replies to questions no one had asked aloud. "Yes, I see you," she murmured once while folding linens. "No, I don't want to go there yet." When asked who she was speaking to, Eleanor only smiled faintly and returned to her work. Edward dismissed his wife's behavior as female hysteria, a convenient Victorian diagnosis for any woman who displayed discomfort or defiance. He advised her to take tonics to rest more and to stop imagining phantoms where there were none. But Eleanor was not imagining. Something in the house had fixed its attention on her, and she felt it pressing closer with each passing day. Children's behavior changes. If Eleanor's behavior was troubling, the transformation in the Addington children was far more unsettling. It began subtly odd games, peculiar turns of phrase, but soon escalated into a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Young William, the youngest of the five, was first to draw attention. Eleanor found him one afternoon standing in the East Wing hallway, speaking quietly to the wall. When she asked who he was talking to, he replied without hesitation, "The sad lady who lives inside." Pressed for details, William described her with unnerving specificity: lace collar, pearl buttons down her back, and a dark spreading stain across her abdomen. The boy claimed she had lived in the house long before the fire. Eleanor, chilled, noted there had been no fire at Addington Manor within living memory. Margaret, 12, grew increasingly volatile. Her governess resigned abruptly after Margaret, without provocation, held a breakfast knife to her throat and murmured, "They told me to open you up and see what's inside." When confronted, Margaret wept and insisted she had no memory of the event. Her night terrors intensified, and she began collecting dead insects, arranging them in geometric patterns on her window sill. The twins, Alexander and Victoria, invented a game they called the Hollow People. In it, one would stand perfectly still, while the other draped them in a sheet and mimed pulling something invisible from their chest. The light inside Alexander explained matter-of-factly when Eleanor asked what they were removing. The hungry ones behind the walls need it to make themselves real, Victoria added with solemn conviction. Eleanor forbade the game, but often heard them playing it in hushed tones when they thought she wasn't near. Even Charles, the eldest, at 16, showed signs of strain. Though outwardly more stable than his siblings, he began carrying a silver letter opener at all times and barricading his bedroom door each night. Servants overheard him pacing for hours after dark, pausing now and then to mutter under his breath. The children's strange behaviors seemed to intensify when Edward was away. Whether this was coincidence or a reaction to his absence, no one could say. But Eleanor felt the connection clearly. Something in the house was working its way into her family, reshaping them piece by piece. Edward's growing absence. Edward Addington, once the dominant presence in every room, began to recede from the daily life of the manor. He spent long hours locked away in his study or the East Wing library, emerging only to take brief, distracted meals before disappearing again. His skin took on a grayish pallor, his once broad frame thinning to the point of gauntness, yet his eyes burned with an unnatural brightness that suggested not weakness, but a feverish intensity. Servants whispered that they sometimes found him standing motionless in odd corners of the house, staring at blank walls for hours, as though reading something only he could see. At times, he mumbled in languages none of them recognized, harsh syllables that seemed to leave the air vibrating long after he fell silent. When he did interact with the household, his demeanor shifted unpredictably. On some days he was irritable and short-tempered, barking orders, with no patience for questions. On others, he seemed almost euphoric, speaking rapidly about alignments and the opening before abruptly cutting himself off. His hands, once steady from years of fine penmanship and precise contracts, now trembled constantly. Staff turnover reached a breaking point. In a single month, 3 servants quit without notice, leaving their belongings behind. One of them, cornered in the village tavern, claimed she had seen a procession of figures in white crossing the lawn at midnight, moving toward the stone circle at the northern edge of the property. Another refused to enter the children's rooms after dark, insisting she had seen something standing over them as they slept. Edward's reaction to these accounts was swift and uncompromising. Any discussion of such hysterical nonsense would be grounds for immediate dismissal without reference. Yet his own absences from the family grew longer, and when he returned from his solitary hours in the East Wing, there was a rawness to his expression, as if each time he stepped back into the household, he was returning from a place where human rules no longer applied. Eleanor watched this transformation with mounting dread. The man she had married, a man already ruthless and ambitious, was being replaced by something she could not name, a presence wearing his face but moved by a different will. The house was taking him just as it was taking the children, and she feared it would not stop until there was nothing left of the family she once knew. East Wing Exploration. By November of 1843, Eleanor's dread had sharpened into something almost unbearable. The house's strange noises had escalated from faint tapping to anguished cries that sometimes cut through her dreams so vividly she woke with her throat raw, convinced she had been screaming in unison with them. She could no longer ignore the fact that nearly all of these sounds originated from the East Wing's upper floors, an area Edward had forbidden anyone, including family, from entering. The ban had been in place since renovations began, enforced with an uncharacteristic severity. The doors to the East Wing's 3rd floor were locked, the keys kept on Edward's persons at all times. Whenever Eleanor broached the subject, he deflected with vague claims about safety or incomplete work. Yet she could not shake the knowledge that he spent hours up there alone, sometimes returning with that terrible look of exultation in his eyes, as if he had been in the presence of something that had elevated him beyond ordinary men. On the evening of November the 13th, Edward was in London on business. The household was quieter than usual, most of the staff having retired early. Eleanor, clutching a small oil lamp, made her way to Edward's private study. From a drawer he thought securely locked, she retrieved a brass key she had long suspected was the one to the East Wing's upper floor. Her hands trembled not from fear of being caught, but from the oppressive certainty that she was about to cross a threshold from which there could be no return. The locked staircase led upward in a slow, spiraling ascent that seemed to stretch unnaturally long. At the top, she found herself in a single vast chamber where architectural logic had been abandoned. Corners bent in ways that made her eyes ache, some narrowing into slits, others yawning wide like inverted arches. The ceiling rose into shadow, disappearing entirely in some places, as though it extended into another sky. But it was the floor that rooted her to the spot. Where she expected oak or marble lay an intricate mosaic of countless tiny tiles in stone, metal, and materials she could not name. The pattern was immense and precise, yet alive with a slow, pulsing shift that her mind could not quite follow. The longer she looked, the more it seemed to undulate, as if something beneath it were breathing. At the center of the mosaic was a circular depression 6 feet across perfectly smooth and dark as a well. She approached it, her own reflection, bending unnaturally in its surface, though the depression was shallow enough to see the bottom. There she thought she saw a flicker of movement, an echo of something vast and patient. It was then she noticed a tapestry hanging against the far wall, its fabric thick with dust. Pulling it aside revealed a narrow doorway leading to a chamber small enough to feel suffocating. The walls were carved with symbols she had never seen, each line etched deep into the stone. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it a book. Hidden chamber. The book was bound in a material that chilled Eleanor's skin to the bone, though it was neither leather nor cloth. Its cover bore no title, only a deep embossing of a pattern that mirrored the mosaic floor outside. She hesitated before touching it, but some compulsion, whether her own or the house's, made her lift it from the pedestal. It was heavier than she expected, the weight strangely uneven, as if some pages were denser than others. Opening it, she found a blend of languages she recognized, Latin, Greek, and others that made her eyes water to look upon. The script seemed to shift slightly when she blinked the letters, resisting her attempts to fix them in place. Scattered throughout the text were illustrations, both intricate and horrifying, human figures in ceremonial arrangements, their chests opened to reveal not organs, but swirling voids filled with points of light, as if each body contained an entire night sky. These images always showed the same architectural feature, a circular chamber-patterned floor and a central depression identical to the room she had just left. Around the human figures were shapes that resisted classification, something between animal and human, yet undeniably neither. Their forms were incomplete, as if the artist had been unable to render them fully or unwilling to show their true appearance. The final section of the book was a ledger of names and dates spanning centuries. Some entries had been scratched out, others marked with sigils Eleanor did not understand. Her eyes froze on the most recent name, Edward Addington. Beside it, in fresh ink, was a date, December 21st, 1843, the winter solstice, little more than a month away. She understood dimly, but with rising horror, that Edward's fortune and power had not come solely from ruthless business dealings. The manor itself had been transformed into a kind of colossal device, a sigil designed to attract and communicate with something beyond the veil of human reality. The deaths during construction had been intentional, their life force fueling whatever mechanism this place had become. Her breath quickened. Somewhere deep in the manor she thought she heard a door close, a sound far too distant for any servant to have made. She turned toward the tapestry, clutching the book as if it might shield her. And there, framed in the doorway, stood Edward. Edward's confrontation. For a moment, neither spoke. The lamplight caught Edward's face, and Eleanor felt her stomach twist. His expression was not anger, not even surprise. It was a cold, appraising curiosity, as though she were an insect pinned to a board. Then his features shifted in a way that made her reel. The skin seemed to ripple, something moving beneath it, like muscle rearranging itself to fit a different shape. His eyes darkened, the pupils swallowing the irises until they became windows opening onto a depthless void. "What are you doing here?" The question was soft, almost gentle, but carried the weight of a predator already certain of its prey. Eleanor tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The book trembled in her grip. "You weren't meant to see this." Edward continued stepping forward. As he moved, the air in the chamber thickened, pressing against her like water. She heard a sound, a low chorus of whispers, not from Edward's mouth, but from somewhere all around her, threading through the cracks in the walls. One of the maids, Harriet Brown, had followed Eleanor out of worry and now stood frozen just inside the mosaic room. Later she would describe what happened to a parish priest in a voice shaking with guilt. "It weren't natural what I saw," she told him. His lordship's face had changed, like there was something else looking out from under his skin. And his eyes, they weren't eyes anymore. The whispers rose in pitch. Eleanor tried to step back but found her feet rooted to the floor. The cold from the mosaic seeped into her bones. Then Edward smiled, a slow, deliberate stretch of the lips that felt rehearsed. "It's too late," he said almost tenderly. "The door is already open." Eleanor's scream began like any human cry of terror, but halfway through it fractured into something impossible, layered, modulated, as if a dozen throats were voicing it at once. Harriet fled unable to watch, but the sound followed her down the staircase and into her dreams for the rest of her life. The next morning, Edward announced that Eleanor had suffered a nervous collapse and would be sent to a private sanatorium in Switzerland. Letters written in a hand, only vaguely like hers, arrived in the following months, describing her recovery. She was never seen again. On the Manor's accounts, ledger, a single entry appeared on November 14th, a large delivery of quicklime to the East Wing. Edward's deterioration. In the weeks following Eleanor's disappearance, Edward's transformation accelerated. The changes were not merely physical, though those were stark enough. His once robust frame continued to waste away, until his skin clung to his bones like thin parchment. His complexion, already ashen, took on a faint translucence, as if something beneath the surface was pressing to get out. His eyes, fever-bright and unblinking, seemed to study those around him with the same clinical detachment a surgeon might reserve for a cadaver. He all but abandoned the social obligations that had once been a cornerstone of his public identity. Invitations were ignored. Business partners left without reply. The staff was cut to the bare minimum, ostensibly to save expenses, though Edward's fortune remained vast. Visitors who did manage to gain entry reported an oppressive stillness throughout the manor, the kind that made breathing feel like a conscious act. Edward's absences from the main house grew longer. Entire nights passed with no sign of him, though strange lights were often seen flaring in the East Wing, thin vertical beams that seemed to rise into the sky and then vanish. On still nights, the wind carried faint but unmistakable sounds from that direction, chanting in a language no one recognized, undercut by what some swore was the sound of children crying in unison. Outside the manor grounds, the surrounding villages began to suffer a spate of tragedies. Livestock were found dead near the estate's borders, their bodies drained of blood without any visible wounds. 7 local children vanished in the span of 6 months, each disappearance occurring within a 10-mile radius of Addington Manor. Authorities claimed the children had run away drowned or fallen victim to vagrants, but their families whispered other explanations, ones that invariably ended with the East Wing. Edward never addressed these rumors. On the rare occasions he was seen in daylight, he appeared distracted, his lips moving silently as though continuing a conversation begun elsewhere. Once, a deliveryman claimed to have seen him in the garden at dawn, standing barefoot in the frost arms raised toward the sky. The man fled before Edward turned, but he swore later that the snow beneath Edward's feet was not melting, it was blackening as though burnt from below. Whatever humanity had once tempered Edward's ambition was gone. In its place stood something colder, more deliberate, and entirely devoted to the thing that had taken root beneath Addington Manor. Charles's hidden journal. Of all the Addington children, only Charles the eldest seemed capable of resisting the strange pull of the house, at least outwardly. At 16, he was old enough to recognize the changes in his father, the fear in the servants, and the way his younger siblings had begun to behave less like children and more like participants in some private, unknowable rite. Charles began keeping a journal written in a cramped hand and hidden inside a hollow section of paneling in the west wing. His early entries were matter-of-fact observations of Edward's absences, accounts of overheard conversations, in languages he didn't understand, notes on the recurring dreams he and his siblings seemed to share. As the weeks went on, the tone grew more urgent. "Father is changing," he wrote in December of 1843. "Not aging, not weakening, but becoming something else. His eyes don't always recognize me. Last week he called me by a name I've never heard before, then looked embarrassed as though he had mistaken me for someone else entirely." By April of 1844, Charles's entries had taken on a tone of desperation. He described finding William in the garden, mutilating a small bird with the same precision Edward used in carving meat at table. He caught Margaret standing motionless in her room for over an hour, staring at the wall and smiling faintly. The twins, he noted, spoke almost exclusively in their private language, stopping only when an adult entered. One entry, dated April 14th, described something far worse. "I saw Father at dawn burying something wrapped in bloodied sheets near the south hedge. He returned with soil under his nails, and a calm I have never seen in him before. I've not seen Margaret since yesterday afternoon." Charles began to plan an escape, sending secret letters to his mother's brother in London. He never received a reply. Whether the letters were intercepted or simply never reached their destination, Charles would not live long enough to find out. The fire of 1844. The night of May 17th, 1844, began with a storm rolling in from the north, lightning flickering behind the hills. Villagers later claimed the thunder never quite reached the manor. Instead, they heard a low, continuous hum that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. Shortly after midnight, a glow appeared in the windows of the east wing, quickly swelling into roaring flames. By the time the local fire brigade arrived, much of the east wing was engulfed. They found Edward standing barefoot in the garden, his nightclothes soaked through, watching the fire with what several witnesses described as rapturous satisfaction. He made no move to help, no attempt to save the children still inside. When the flames were finally subdued, the brigade entered the cellar. There they found a sight that would haunt them to their graves, the bodies of all 5 Addington children arranged in a perfect circle around a stone altar. None bore burns severe enough to have been killed by the fire. Their chests had been opened not crudely, but with surgical precision, and the cavities were empty. The patterns in which the bodies were placed matched the diagrams later found in the book Eleanor had discovered months before. Investigators could not agree on whether the symbols on the cellar floor had been painted or burned into the stone. The smell of scorched metal hung heavy in the air. Edward was arrested but declared unfit to stand trial. He was committed to Bedlam Asylum, where he spent the remainder of his life in near catatonic silence. Yet asylum records note that during certain astronomical events, particularly the winter solstice, he would erupt into frenzied activity, drawing intricate symbols on his cell walls with whatever material was at hand, including his own blood. The fire should have ended the story of Addington Manor. Instead, it became only the first chapter in a pattern that would repeat across generations. James Addington. 1850s. The manor lay in ruin for 6 years after the fire. Its east wing gutted the surrounding gardens, overgrown the remaining structure left to weather under the harsh northern skies. Locals avoided even the road that passed within sight of it, preferring to take long, muddy detours rather than risk catching a glimpse of its blackened windows. In that silence, the story of Edward's crimes began to blend with older tales, until the Addington name itself was spoken only in hushed tones. Then, in 1850, a distant cousin emerged from obscurity. James Addington was a man of letters, not industry, a respected scholar with a modest fortune, known for his publications on antiquarian history and classical languages. By all accounts, he had no taste for the brutal business practices that had defined Edward's life, and no prior connection to the manor beyond bloodline. His sudden interest in the property bewildered even his closest associates. James acquired the estate for a token sum, citing family legacy as his motivation. To those who raised the subject of its past, he offered confident dismissals. The tragedies were the result of one man's madness, nothing more. The house itself, he argued, was an architectural treasure worthy of restoration, not abandonment. Reconstruction began that summer following Edward's original floor plans with uncanny precision. Where scorched beams had fallen, identical replacements were installed. The mosaic floor in the east wing's upper chamber was recreated tile for tile, though James never explained how he knew its exact design. In less than 2 years, the manor stood as it had before the fire, pristine and complete, as if the intervening destruction had been no more than a dream. It was only after James and his family moved in that the old patterns began to stir. His wife, Rebecca, would later write to her sister of James's growing absences, his increasing fixation on the east wing. He spent 3 days and nights there without emerging, she wrote in 1853. When he returned, he seemed younger somehow, though there was something wrong about his eyes. They reflected light like a cat's in the dark. When she confronted him, he replied, "I was never absent, my dear. I've been here all along watching you sleep." Within months, the household was plagued by the same phenomena that had marked Edward's decline. Objects moving without cause, voices in empty rooms, children waking from shared nightmares. And inevitably whispers began again in the village. Whispers of missing children. Generational pattern. From James's tenure onward, a chilling regularity emerged. Each time an Addington patriarch claimed the manor, he would spend increasing amounts of time in the east wing. Each time his personality would change, sometimes subtly at first, sometimes with alarming speed. Family members would vanish or die under unexplained circumstances, and each time the house would eventually suffer another accident, a fire, a structural collapse, an incident that gutted part of the property, but left the foundations intact. 4 generations passed between Edward and the turn of the 20th century. In that time, Addington Manor was rebuilt 3 times, each reconstruction more faithful to the original than the last. Always the east wing remained untouched in its essential design. parish records in the neighboring village of Thornfield documented a disturbing parallel during each period when the manor was inhabited. Disappearances of local children spiked dramatically. Between 1850 and 1870, 23 children vanished without trace within a 10-mile radius of the manor. Authorities investigated, but no evidence tied the crimes to the Addington family, at least none that could be presented in court. The Addingtons themselves became increasingly reclusive, their lives folding inward behind locked gates and shuttered windows. Local superstition began to frame the family, not merely as cursed, but as active participants in something far older. The old stone circles and burial mounds near the property were said to wake whenever an Addington was in residence. Farmers swore they saw pale figures moving across the moors at night, always toward the east wing. By the 1890s, the Addington legacy was no longer a scandal but a grim inevitability. The house would be claimed. The house would consume. The pattern was unbreakable, or so it seemed. Richard Addington's Scientific Skepticism. 1901, 1902. In 1901, the property passed to Richard Addington, a London physician with no prior involvement in the family estate. A man of science and a skeptic by training, Richard saw the manor not as a curse to be feared, but as a case study to be dismantled. The so-called Addington curse, he wrote to a colleague, is nothing more than a confluence of unfortunate events likely exacerbated by environmental factors such as carbon monoxide poisoning, which could explain the hallucinations and erratic behavior reported here. Richard moved in with his wife Elizabeth and their 2 young children. He modernized the house almost immediately, installing electric lighting throughout, a novelty in rural England, and bringing in a team of scientists to conduct a thorough analysis of the property. They tested the air for toxins, examined the water supply, and assessed the structural integrity of every wall and beam. For a time, the results seemed to support his skepticism. No toxins were found, the structure was sound, and his family lived in comfort. But within 6 months, Richard's private correspondence took a darker turn. In increasingly agitated handwriting, he began to describe phenomena that defied explanation. There is something here. I've seen it moving through the walls at night. I've heard it whispering in languages dead for millennia. The children hear it too. They've started drawing pictures of it. His final letter, dated November 12, 1902, contained a revelation that would never leave the Addington family's shadow. The East Wing, always the East Wing. I've discovered why the original foundations remain intact. Edward wasn't the first. The Blackwoods before him, and God knows how many others before them, they all found it. The chamber beneath the East Wing is older than the manor, older perhaps than England itself. The symbols on the walls match nothing in any archaeological record, yet I recognize them. They speak to something primitive in my mind. God help me, I understand now what must be done, what has always been done. 3 days later, Richard's wife and children were found dead in their beds, their faces frozen in masks of absolute terror. Richard himself was discovered in the cellar beneath the East Wing, his body contorted into an impossible position, surrounded by arcane symbols, drawn in a mixture of blood and ash. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. The responding officers would later require psychiatric care. Cambridge Expedition, 1923. By the early 1920s, Addington Manor had been abandoned for over 2 decades. The windows were boarded, the gates rusted shut, and ivy climbed unchecked along its stone facade. Most locals regarded it as an untouchable ruin, the kind of place one crossed themselves when passing. But to a certain circle of academics at Cambridge University, it was an opportunity too valuable to ignore. In 1923, Professor Walter Hartley, a respected anthropologist specializing in ancient religions, secured rare legal access to the property for research purposes. His team, composed of graduate students and 2 colleagues from the archaeology department, intended to document and compare the symbols reported in the manor's cellar with known occult traditions. Hartley's stated goal was purely academic, to determine whether the carvings were remnants of ancient pagan ritual or later Gothic ornamentation. For 3 days, the expedition catalogued the visible portions of the house, noting the east wing's uncanny preservation despite decades of neglect. The 4th day was reserved for the cellar beneath the east wing, sealed for decades after the tragedy of 1902. Armed with lanterns, measuring tools, and sketch pads, the team descended the stone steps. Only one member of the expedition, a graduate student named Thomas Piper, would ever return. Piper's account, recorded in the journal he kept during and after the trip, described the cellar not as a static space, but as something mutable. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift when not directly observed, their angles subtly altering their proportions, warping as though the stone itself were pliable. "It is not ornamentation," Piper wrote, "but language. A mathematics beyond Euclid, designed not for beauty, but for function. This room is not a tomb, it is a mechanism." What happened next is pieced together from fragments of his writings. Hartley, convinced the symbols were a form of non-Euclidean equation meant to solve problems of dimensional transit, attempted a reconstruction of what he believed to be the original ritual. Piper claimed he saw the walls flex inward as though the cellar were inhaling. Shapes appeared beyond the circle of their lantern light, too large, too fluid to be human, as the air took on a density that made movement sluggish, as if they were wading through invisible water. Piper fled before the ritual concluded. His last sight of his colleagues was of them standing stock-still, faces lifted towards something unseen above their expressions, not of fear, but of overwhelming rapture. He never saw them again. Thomas Piper's account. The door. In the weeks following his escape, Piper was institutionalized for what doctors called severe delusional episodes. His journal, however, told a different story. In painstaking detail, he described the chamber as a door to somewhere else, a threshold not between 2 rooms, but between 2 realities. The others weren't killed. Piper insisted in one passage they were taken. I heard their voices even as I ran layer together, chanting in a language that was not language. They were answering something that spoke from the other side. He noted that the shapes glimpsed in the periphery of his vision moved in ways that defied human musculature, bending in places where no joints should exist, folding and unfolding like paper given breath. Most disturbing was his description of what lay beyond the threshold. "I saw only a glimpse," he wrote, "but it was enough to break the axis of my mind. The sky, or what served as sky, was too close, pressing down as though it had weight. The ground shimmered like liquid glass, and in its surface I saw my own reflection looking back at me, except it was older and smiling." Piper spent the remainder of his life in isolation, painting intricate, surreal landscapes that attempted to capture what he had seen. Many of these works are stored under restricted access at Miskatonic University in Massachusetts, reportedly due to the psychological effects they have on prolonged viewers. A few remain in private collections traded discreetly among those with an interest in the manor's darker legacy. His final journal entry, dated years after the expedition, offered no resolution, only a warning: the door is never truly closed. It swings both ways, and it remembers those who have touched its frame. Extraordinary Threats Division, Wartime Experiments. When World War II erupted, the British government saw potential in any phenomenon that might offer an advantage, no matter how esoteric. Classified records declassified decades later revealed that in 1939 the Addington property was quietly requisitioned by a covert branch of military intelligence known as the Extraordinary Threats Division, ETD. Under the command of Colonel James Blackwood, a name that sent uneasy ripples through those familiar with the manor's history, the ETD began a series of experiments centered on the East Wing cellar. Their reports described localized reality distortions that intensified in the presence of human emotion, particularly fear and desire. The symbols on the walls were treated not as decoration, but as a kind of programming language commands for manipulating the phenomena. Test subjects drawn from both military volunteers and civilians were exposed to the chamber for increasing durations. The results were catastrophic. Some subjects lapsed into catatonia within hours. Others erupted into fits of extreme violence. A few reported encounters with perfect doubles of themselves, or with long-deceased relatives who spoke in voices that didn't match their remembered tones. Perhaps most unsettling were the temporal anomalies. Clocks placed in different parts of the manor ran at inconsistent speeds. In one documented incident, a researcher entered the East Wing for what he perceived as 20 minutes. When he emerged, 3 days had passed. His journal, some 200 pages written in cramped, frantic script, contained a single phrase repeated endlessly: "They're watching from behind the walls." By 1944, casualties among ETD personnel were deemed operationally unsustainable. Colonel Blackwood ordered the cellar sealed with reinforced concrete. In his final report, he recommended the manor's complete destruction, the land assaulted, and all records erased from public archives. "What we have contained here," he wrote, "is not defeated, it is only imprisoned. And imprisonment is never permanent." The government did not heed his warning. Abandonment and minimal oversight, 1944-1976. After Colonel Blackwood's order to seal the East Wing cellar in 1944, Addington Manor passed into a long, uneasy silence. The concrete barrier stood as a blunt scar across the chamber's threshold, its rough grey surface at odds with the house's ornate Gothic interior. The official story was that the manor had been repurposed as a secure military storage site. But by the late 1940s, even that pretense had faded. The grounds quickly surrendered to neglect. Brambles climbed the stone walls, shutters banged loose in the wind. The drive became a rutted track choked with weeds. To the few who ventured close enough to see the manor seemed less abandoned than dormant, like an animal in hibernation conserving its energy. Still, the government never fully relinquished its grip. In 1952, a small weather monitoring station was established less than a mile from the property, manned by rotating personnel under orders never to approach the manor itself. Unbeknownst to most of the staff, their weather instruments were modified to detect fluctuations in electromagnetic fields and localized temperature anomalies. The records they kept are sparse, but telling spikes in EM readings during solstices and equinoxes, sharp temperature drops without any meteorological explanation, and faint vibrations recorded in the soil that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The station's presence kept away all but the most determined trespassers. Even so, thrill-seekers occasionally breached the grounds. Some returned with tales of hearing footsteps pacing above them in empty rooms or of glimpsing figures in upper windows that should have been boarded shut. Others didn't return at all, their disappearance folded quietly into the region's long history of unexplained vanishings. By the 1970s, public interest in the manor had dwindled. Budget cuts in 1976 led to the closure of the monitoring station. The final report, filed before the withdrawal, contained a single sentence under recommendations. Continued absence of oversight is inadvisable. It was ignored. For nearly 20 years afterward, the manor was left entirely unguarded. A gaping wound in the countryside's skin healed over, perhaps, but still festering beneath. Victor Reynolds and the Morphic Resonance Society, 1995. The manor's long dormancy ended in 1995 when American tech magnate Victor Reynolds purchased the property for a nominal fee from a government entity that seemed eager to rid itself of the responsibility. Reynolds, who had made his fortune in early internet infrastructure, was known for his eccentric investments, particularly in fringe science and the paranormal. On paper, Reynolds intended to renovate Addington Manor into a private research facility, exploring the boundaries of human perception. In truth, his motivations ran deeper. Reynolds was an active member of the Morphic Resonance Society, an obscure occult organization founded in the 1920s. The Society's core belief was that certain locations acted as focal points where consciousness and reality intertwined, and that with the proper techniques, one could manipulate the physical world through thought alone. In their literature, Addington Manor was identified as a potential alpha site, a location of unparalleled potential. Reynolds moved in that spring accompanied by a multidisciplinary team of scientists and engineers, all of whom were also society members. They brought with them equipment at the cutting edge of the time-early brain-computer interfaces, quantum field detectors, and prototype systems for reality mapping. These were set up primarily in the East Wing, which Reynolds had earmarked as the core of their research. His stated mission was deceptively simple: to strip away the superstitious framework that had accumulated around the manor and approach its anomalies as a natural phenomenon. What the Addingtons stumbled upon through blood and ritual, he wrote in a project memo, we will master through technology. For 6 months, research proceeded with a methodical precision. The team documented measurable gravitational anomalies within certain rooms, spontaneous drops in temperature, and a peculiar form of information, bleed data, appearing on their systems without human input, often in the form of mathematical equations or fragments of text in multiple languages. One phrase in particular appeared repeatedly across different systems in different forms. The door swings both ways. The fractured seal. In August 1996, ground-penetrating radar revealed that the concrete barrier placed by the ETD in 1944 had fractured in several places. The cause was unclear: natural settling seismic activity or something less explainable. Environmental samples taken from the cracks contained particles of unknown composition. Dr. Eleanor Chen, the project's physicist, noted in her report, These particles exist in multiple states simultaneously and appear to respond to conscious observation. In simpler terms, they become what we expect them to be. Reynolds saw this as a breakthrough. Against the cautious advice of some team members, he authorized the widening of one of the fissures and the deployment of drones equipped with cameras and sensors. The footage they retrieved shook even the most skeptical among them. The chamber had expanded far beyond its original dimensions. The geometry was wrong angles that could not exist, distances that stretched or contracted depending on the viewer's perspective. The walls were alive with the same shifting symbols described by Thomas Piper in 1923, but now they moved with purpose, rearranging themselves in response to the drone's presence. Most disturbing were the glimpses always at the edge of the camera's range of forms that resembled human silhouettes, distorted as if seen through rippling water. They did not approach, but there was no mistaking their attention. Reynolds wrote in his log, "We are not studying them, we are being studied. And with every experiment they are learning how to see us more clearly." Despite mounting unease among the team, Reynolds pushed forward with his ultimate plan, a controlled communion with the chamber's reality, facilitated by their brain-computer interfaces. He believed that if a human mind could perceive the gateway directly while remaining anchored in the physical world, the mysteries of Addington Manor would finally yield to human understanding. The date he chose for the attempt, October 31st, 1996, was no accident. The controlled communion experiment. By late October 1996, the team's data had become undeniable. The chamber beneath the East Wing was not a static space, but a responsive system. The shifting symbols acted almost like code-complex, self-modifying instructions written in a language of angles, distances, and vibrations. For Reynolds, this was not a reason to retreat. It was the invitation he had been waiting for. The plan was simple in design, catastrophic in implication. Using the team's brain-computer interface, Riggs' bulky headsets, wired into an array of sensors and processors, they would attempt to project a human consciousness into the chamber's reality without physically crossing its threshold. The subject's mind would step through while their body remained safely in the manor above. It was intended as a one-way observation, tightly monitored and reversible. Dr. Marcus Wayland, the team's neurologist, volunteered. He was calm almost unnervingly, so as he allowed electrodes to be placed along his scalp and chest. "If this works," he told Reynolds, "it will be the greatest expansion of human perception since we first looked up at the stars." The experiment was scheduled for Samhain, October 1st, a date of particular resonance in the old Celtic calendar when the boundary between worlds was said to thin. The session was staged in a cleared room directly above the fractured seal. Equipment hummed softly. Data feeds flickered with streams of incomprehensible numbers. At first the experiment proceeded as planned. Wayland's voice was low but steady as he described what he saw. "It's beautiful. The geometry is impossible in our space. Colors, I can't name colors that shouldn't exist." Then his tone shifted. "There are entities here. They're watching me. They're curious." A pause. "Oh God, they recognize me. How is that possible?" "They're calling me by name, but not the name I use now. They're calling me Addington." Moments later, his body convulsed violently. The monitors spiked into unreadable chaos. Wayland's voice changed, becoming a layered chorus of male and female tones, young and old, speaking in perfect unison. "We have always been here, before your kind crawled from the oceans, before your world cooled from fire. You have served us generation after generation. Addington, Blackwood, Reynolds. Names change. Blood remembers. The door swings both ways. Now we return the favor. The lights flickered. Several team members screamed as a low vibration rolled through the room, bending the air like heat haze. Then the feeds went dead. The breach emergency protocols kicked in, automatically locking down the east wing, but whatever had crossed over was not bound by doors or walls. Witnesses, those who survived, spoke of shadows that moved independently of their sources, stretching into shapes with too many joints, too many eyes. The air thickened until breathing felt like drowning. One researcher clawed at his own face, insisting something was trying to pull him through from the inside. The source of the rupture was traced to the fractured seal in the cellar. Surveillance drones sent in moments before the power failed entirely captured footage of the chamber's interior, expanding like a lung. The depression in the center pulsed with light, and the human-like silhouettes that had once lingered at the periphery now pressed against the boundary, their forms shivering with anticipation. Then came the sound, low at first, then deafening, a single note layered with countless voices. Glass shattered throughout the east wing. Equipment sparked and caught fire. The final frames from the drone feed showed one of the silhouettes stepping forward, its edges rippling, and then nothing but static. The explosion that followed was not like any conventional blast. The east wing did not shatter outward. It folded inward, collapsing into a space far smaller than the volume it had occupied. Survivors described the implosion as silent, the sound coming only after, like thunder following lightning. When first responders arrived, they found the east wing reduced to a smoldering crater. Reynolds' body was recovered in several pieces, his skin and muscles arranged in precise geometric patterns on the scorched floor. Most of the other team members were unrecognizable, their remains twisted as if by immense pressure applied from multiple directions at once. Dr. Wayland's body was intact. His skin bore no wounds, but when the coroner opened him, they found nothing inside, not a single organ, not a drop of blood. Rapid government containment. The response was swift and absolute. Within hours of the breach, military transports surrounded the site under the cover of chemical contamination. All surviving members of the team were taken into custody and placed under indefinite medical observation. Any recording equipment, personal notes, or digital storage devices recovered from the ruins were seized and classified. Satellite imagery from the weeks that followed shows the construction of a massive reinforced concrete structure over the remains of the East Wing. Officially, it was billed as an environmental containment facility. In reality, it was a multi-layered barrier incorporating steel lead and materials whose composition remains undisclosed. Power consumption records from the installation indicated a constant draw, sufficient for a small city, consistent with high-capacity electromagnetic field generators. Leaked documents from 2018 suggest the containment was never perfect. Reports of minor seismic activity in the region increased in the years after the incident, accompanied by electromagnetic disturbances and unexplained equipment failures. More disturbingly, local hospitals began noting a pattern in births after 2016, an unusually high number of infants born with faint patterned birthmarks, eerily similar to the symbols carved into the East Wing cellar. The government has never acknowledged these correlations, but in private briefings, Analysts have warned that the Addington pattern may be reasserting itself not through a single bloodline as in centuries past, but through an entire generation. The implication is chilling. The door may not require the manor anymore. It may be opening inside the people themselves. Post-2014 disturbances. For nearly 2 decades after the 1996 breach, Addington Manor remained sealed beneath the government's heavy humming shroud of concrete and steel. Officially, the site was a decommissioned, hazardous waste facility. Unofficially, it was a wound that still bled, though the bleeding was invisible to the eye. Then, in 2014, the disturbances began. It started small lights flickering in the surrounding villages during clear weather, livestock vanishing from enclosed barns without any sign of forced entry, and an uptick in reports of sleep paralysis, accompanied by identical hallucinations, shadowed figures standing at the foot of the bed. At first, the events were easy to dismiss as coincidence or folklore. But in February of that year, a county-wide blackout occurred during a routine maintenance cycle at the containment site. The outage lasted just under 3 minutes. In that brief window, hundreds of residents across a 30-mile radius reported hearing the same sound, a low resonant hum, like a plucked cello string but coming from inside their own homes. Some claimed the noise was accompanied by a metallic taste in their mouths, others that they could feel their teeth vibrating. Surveillance footage from several homes during the blackout revealed something stranger, still objects moving ever so slightly without human contact. Chairs scraped across floors, curtains billowed despite closed windows, and in one home, a child's wooden toy began rolling back and forth with mechanical precision. Most disturbing of all was the correlation with personal electronics. Smartphones, televisions, even digital watches displayed brief flashes of symbols, complex looping shapes that experts later confirmed were identical to the markings documented on the East Wing's chamber walls in 1923-1944, and again during the 1996 breach. Whatever had been contained beneath the manor was no longer fully bound. And if the door had once been anchored in stone and soil, it now seemed capable of reaching out through the very fabric of the surrounding environment. Genetic traces of the Addington bloodline. The following year, 2015, brought a revelation that shifted the nature of the threat from local to potentially global. An independent genetic study conducted at Newcastle University sought to trace familial patterns in the Northumberland region. The study was meant to be routine mapping hereditary diseases, but it stumbled upon a recurring genetic marker that baffled researchers. The marker, a rare sequence not catalogued in existing databases, appeared disproportionately in individuals whose families had lived within a 50-mile radius of Addington Manor for more than 3 generations. More troubling, its presence correlated with unusual neurological activity. Subjects displayed heightened sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, above-average rates of lucid dreaming, and in some cases, anomalous brainwave patterns, previously associated only with deep meditative states or near-death experiences. When historical genealogical records were cross-referenced, the picture grew darker. The marker appeared in every known surviving branch of the Addington family, but also in dozens of other family trees, many of which had no documented relation to the original bloodline. The only consistent link was geography and the proximity to the manor. Government interest was swift. Several of the study's lead researchers were recruited into undisclosed positions within a new environmental health task force. Public access to the full dataset was revoked. The study's published version omitted the marker entirely. Yet whispers circulated in scientific circles the Addington trait was not recessive. It was proliferating. And if the chamber beneath the manor had once needed a physical host to bridge its world with ours, it might now be capable of using any carrier of that genetic signature consciously or not. The shared dreams phenomenon. By 2018, a pattern of reports emerged that could no longer be ignored even by skeptics. Entire families, sometimes entire streets, claimed to have experienced the same dream on the same night. The details varied slightly from person to person, but the structure was consistent, a vast, dimly lit hall, its walls shifting with the same incomprehensible symbols described in every historical account of the Addington chamber. In these dreams, there was always a sound, a slow, deliberate knocking as though something enormous were on the other side of a door. Sometimes it was 3 knocks, sometimes more, but always followed by a voice not booming but intimate, as if whispered directly into the dreamer's ear. The voice never spoke in the same language twice. One night it was Latin, another an extinct Celtic dialect, another a language no living linguist could identify. Yet every dreamer understood the message perfectly. It is almost time. Some reported waking with nosebleeds, others with geometric bruises on their arms or torsos that faded within hours. A handful claimed that upon waking they could still hear the knocking for several seconds in the silence of their own bedrooms. Psychologists and neurologists suggested mass hysteria or a form of culturally contagious sleep paralysis. But when dream logs from different towns were compared, timestamps revealed something chilling. In over 80% of cases, the knocking in the dream occurred at precisely 3:17 a.m., the same minute across multiple time zones adjusted for local time. It was as if something was moving through the sleeping minds of the region, knocking on each in turn, testing the hinges. And the number of reports was climbing. Manifestations in waking life. By early 2019, the dreams had begun to spill into waking hours. Reports from residents around the sealed site described fleeting peripheral sightings, a shadow moving in the wrong direction relative to the sun, a figure standing still at the bend of a road only to vanish when approached, or the outline of a door forming on solid walls. The most disturbing incidents occurred in places far from the manor schools, hospitals, even supermarkets. One widely documented case took place in a primary school classroom where a group of 7-year-olds froze mid-activity. When the teacher asked what was wrong, they pointed in unison to the corner of the room and said, "The tall man is here." Security footage, later reviewed by investigators, showed nothing unusual in the visible spectrum, but thermal imaging revealed a distinct humanoid heat signature, standing motionless for nearly 2 minutes before disappearing without transition. No walking, no fading, simply gone. In another case, a farmer in the nearby village of Crofton reported finding all 43 of his sheep standing in a perfect circle, facing inward, their bodies pressed so tightly together they could not be separated without force. When he finally pushed through to the center of the formation, he found the soil bare and dry with a faint heat rising from it despite the winter frost. Most unsettling was the way these phenomena mirrored details recorded during the manor's documented active years in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The same shapes, the same impossible arrangements, the same lingering sense of being observed. It was as though the destruction of the East Wing had not eliminated the connection, only scattered it like shrapnel embedded in the surrounding land. The 2021 containment breach. For years, the government's containment protocols had relied on the assumption that the manor's remnants were the sole physical anchor for whatever lay beyond the chamber's seal. That assumption collapsed in June 2021. During a routine inspection of the underground barrier, monitoring equipment detected a sudden spike in electromagnetic activity, magnitudes higher than those recorded even during the 1996 incident. The surge lasted less than 6 minutes, but it was enough to fry every sensor within the lower 3 levels of the facility. When the field teams descended to investigate, they found the central chamber not sealed, but absent. The reinforced walls meant to encase it remained intact, but the space inside them was gone, replaced by a featureless void that absorbed light. Laser rangefinders failed to register a return signal, as if the beam were being swallowed entirely. 3 operatives entered the void tethered to a winch system. Only one returned, screaming incoherently and clawing at his own face. His eyes, when pried open, were entirely black iris sclera and pupil reflecting light like a mirror. He died of massive cardiac arrest 37 hours later. Autopsy revealed his brain tissue was riddled with microfractures as though exposed to sudden changes in pressure. Satellite data from that night recorded a faint but measurable distortion in the air above the facility, a rippling effect consistent with extreme localized heat, though no rise in temperature was recorded. The anomaly expanded over the next 12 hours, eventually vanishing without warning. By then, reports of strange occurrences had spiked across the region. Electrical surges, animals refusing to enter certain buildings, and in one particularly grim case, a man found dead in his home. His body arranged in the same geometric pattern seen on Dr. Reynolds' remains in 1996. The reappearance of the East Wing. In the autumn of 2022, something happened that defied all attempts at rational explanation. The East Wing returned. On October 14th, locals awoke to see the manor's silhouette standing once again against the Northumberland horizon, its familiar jagged roofline and weathered stone facade visible exactly where it had been before the 1996 implosion. This was not a reconstruction. There had been no work crews, no deliveries, no scaffolding. The building was simply there as if the last 26 years had never happened. Witnesses who ventured close enough reported that the structure looked aged, yet untouched by recent weather. Its windows were dark, though some claimed to have seen movement inside shapes passing before the glass, pausing and then withdrawing into the shadows. A thin mist clung to the building even on clear days, and those who stepped within 50 feet described feeling a faint vibration through the soles of their shoes as if the ground itself were resonating. Attempts by authorities to cordon off the area failed. Physical barriers erected during the day were found dismantled by morning, the metal twisted into spirals or folded flat without signs of cutting. The most unnerving detail came from a small group of urban explorers who live-streamed their approach to the East Wing. As they drew near, the feed began to distort the image, breaking into fragments of static and warped color. Before the stream cut entirely, one of the explorers could be heard whispering, "It's not rebuilt. It's not stone. It's breathing." The expansion beyond the grounds. By winter 2022, it became clear that the reappearance of the East Wing was not a static event. The perimeter of its influence, once confined to the manor's footprint, was widening. Subtle at first, the spread manifested as changes in soil, composition, electromagnetic disturbances, and unexplained structural warping in nearby buildings. Locals began reporting strange optical effects in streets that had never been within sight of the manor. Walls would appear to bulge outward, then snap back into shape when touched. In certain alleyways, the air shimmered as though under intense summer heat, despite temperatures near freezing. One farmer swore he had watched the distant outline of the east wing stretch just for an instant across the fields toward his property before contracting like a rubber band. The expansion also brought an increase in missing persons. In nearly every case, the disappearance was preceded by a report of the individual wandering toward a place that should not have existed, an unmarked road, a door in the side of a hill, a hallway in their own home that they had never seen before. None returned. Environmental scans showed that the ground within a 2-mile radius had begun to register as non-reflective on radar imaging, as though the subsurface material had been replaced by something incapable of bouncing back a signal. Satellite photographs revealed faint, almost organic patterns in the surrounding field's lines that curved and twisted in ways eerily similar to the symbols inside the chamber before it vanished. By the end of January, the phenomenon reached as far as the coast nearly 17 miles away. Fishermen reported seeing the manor's windows in the reflection of calm sea water, even when facing away from shore. Whatever was contained within those walls was no longer confined to them. It was moving outward in deliberate pulses as if breathing, the bloodline convergence. Around this same time, medical professionals began to notice an unusual trend in the local hospital's maternity ward. A disproportionate number of newborns, nearly 1 in 6, displayed an odd physical trait, a faint circular birthmark at the base of the school. While initially dismissed as harmless, further examination revealed that the mark was not a skin discoloration, but a subtle indentation in the skull bone itself, forming a near-perfect ring. Genetic testing of these infants revealed the same rare marker identified in the 2015 Newcastle University study, the Addington trait. However, the marker's prevalence had skyrocketed, appearing in children born to parents with no documented familial ties to the region. More unsettling was the behavioral profile emerging among these children as they aged. By the time they reached 3 or 4 years old, many demonstrated advanced spatial awareness, an uncanny ability to navigate unfamiliar spaces, and in some cases, a tendency to stand motionless for long periods, staring at blank walls as though listening to something on the other side. Records obtained through whistleblower testimony suggested that the government's Environmental Health Task Force had shifted its primary focus from containment to recruitment. Families were quietly approached, offered incentives to relocate to undisclosed facilities for the children's benefit. The convergence was underway. The bloodline, once diluted and scattered, was being reassembled intentionally, or not. Whatever lay beyond the East Wing's threshold seemed to be weaving its influence directly into human heredity, as if building a network of living conduits. The final transmission, on April 9, 2023, a small team of independent investigators, 3 men and 1 woman, breached the East Wing for the first time since its sudden return. Their live stream began at 10:42 p.m., showing the group approaching under the pale light of a half-moon. They were armed with basic cameras, handheld EMF meters, and headlamps. The initial footage revealed nothing unusual beyond the manor's now familiar breathing effect, the slow, rhythmic swelling and contracting of its walls. At 10:59 p.m., the team crossed the threshold. Their audio feed distorted, immediately replaced by a low, resonant hum identical to that heard during the 2014 blackout. Inside, the space did not match the exterior dimensions. Corridors stretched for impossible distances, their walls curving gently inward like the inside of a massive rib cage. Symbols, shifting and pulsing faintly, ran along every surface. The last coherent moment of the broadcast occurred at 11:07 p.m., when one of the investigators whispered, "The knocking. It's here." A series of 3 deep, echoing knocks followed, though the sound was so heavy it seemed to vibrate the camera lens. Then came the voice familiar from the shared dreams, but now clearer, speaking in English. "You have always been inside." The camera spun violently, capturing a fleeting glimpse of something vast and jointed, moving just beyond the range of the headlamp. Then the feed collapsed into static. Attempts to contact the team failed. Their vehicle was found parked at the manor's edge the next morning, doors wide open, engines still warm. There were no footprints leading away. The live stream file, downloaded by thousands before it was taken down, remains the last known evidence from within the East Wing. And for those who have watched it, a strange pattern has emerged within weeks of viewing. Some begin to dream of a long hallway, a slow knocking, and a door they are certain they have never seen, but feel compelled to open. Epilogue: The Door That Waits by Summer, 2023. Official communication about the East Wing ceased entirely. The government's task force, once present in full hazmat gear and armored transports, withdrew overnight without public explanation. No one saw them leave, yet by morning the checkpoints were gone, the fences dismantled, and the road to the manor stood open for the first time in decades. What replaced them was a silence heavier than any military presence could have imposed. No signs warned trespassers away, no floodlights scanned the grounds. It was as if the authorities had decided not that the site was safe, but that nothing more could be done. And perhaps more telling, nothing more needed to be contained. Satellite imagery taken in August showed the manor's outline faint and blurred, as though photographed through fog even on cloudless days. But the surrounding land, it was changing. Shapes resembling roads and pathways began appearing in fields where no human had built. These lines, when mapped, spiraled toward the manor in intricate patterns, matching the interior markings recorded during the 2021 containment breach. Farmers who plowed across these lines reported broken machinery, dead livestock, and most disturbingly, strange whispers beneath the soil when the plow blades bit too deep. Inside nearby villages, the children born with the skull ring mark were reaching an age where their behaviors could no longer be dismissed as quirks. Several were found missing from their homes in the early hours of the morning. In every case, the front door was still locked from the inside, no windows broken, no signs of forced entry. One family installed a camera in their living room after suspecting sleepwalking. The footage captured their 7-year-old standing in the center of the room at 3:17 a.m., head tilted toward a blank wall, murmuring in a language no one could identify. Then she stepped forward and was gone, vanished as if the wall had swallowed her. Locals who still dare to speak of the manor say its windows glow faintly just before dawn, not with candlelight, but with something colder, like moonlight filtered through deep water. They say the knocking, once heard only in dreams, can now be felt in the chest when standing within a mile of the estate. 3 knocks a pause, 3 more, always in sets of 6. Researchers who privately study the case believe the manor is no longer a building in the traditional sense. Instead, they suggest it has become an interface, a physical threshold to something existing alongside, beneath, or beyond our reality. The reappearance of the East Wing was not the return of an old structure, but the arrival of a fixed anchor point in an ongoing expansion. And now, with the bloodline dispersed across the region, that expansion no longer needs the building. It has human vessels. If this theory is true, the fate of the investigators lost in April 2023 may be a preview of what awaits anyone who reaches the final door. And that door, they warn, will not always require travel to Northumberland to find, because the dreams are spreading. And in the dreams there is always the same hallway, always the same 3 knocks. And for those who hear them, the feeling that opening the door is inevitable. The last surviving descendant of the Addington family, who has lived under assumed names since the 1980s, was recently asked off-record what advice they would give to anyone who hears the knocking. They replied without hesitation, "Don't open it, and don't think that means you can keep it closed forever."